On this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, uniting our nation. And I ask every American to join me in this cause.
1 year into his administration, is President Biden delivering on his electoral promises to the American people? Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. A year since taking office, how has U.S. President Joe Biden fared in the job? The 46th president assumed power at a time of deep polarization, fanned by his predecessor Donald Trump. His 4 years in office ended with a failed insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, hailed, if not instigated, by a president who was unwilling to accept defeat. Biden entered the White House after a year of protests and tensions surrounding racial injustice across the U.S., following the murder of George Floyd and several other African Americans by white police officers. The country's reckoning with systemic racism was an important part and focus of Biden's campaign. In his inaugural address, he promised to deliver on racial justice, saying, quote, "The dream of justice for all can be deferred no longer." His words echoed those of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday, a federal holiday since 1983, was commemorated earlier this week. But despite Biden's promises, he has so far been unable to deliver on two key pieces of legislation aimed at tackling racial injustice: police reform and voting rights. This follows efforts by Republican-controlled states to enact laws that effectively make voting more difficult, particularly for people of color, in what has been described as the greatest attack on voting rights since the civil rights movement led by Dr. King. So what would America's most famous civil rights leader have thought about the state of racial justice and voting rights in 2022 and President Biden's leadership? We're joined by Bernice King. She was 5 years old when her father, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated. She is the CEO of the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. She's also a lawyer and a minister. Reverend King, a year ago, Joe Biden said he would lead what he called the great battle for racial justice in America. He promised, in fact, to put racial justice at the center of his agenda and to make it part of everything he does as president. Has he?
Well, I mean, there's always room for growth in our nation. Certainly that is the case with our current president, Joe Biden. There's so many issues that we're faced with the pandemic, with infrastructure, with racial justice certainly being a preeminent issue, and voting rights that comes along with that, to me, is an important issue, although from my perspective, voting rights is an issue of our democracy that is important to all communities. And so, I would say that he can certainly do more in the regard to the Black community, because there are things that, we still do not have. I mean, that check that my father talked about we still have not received sufficient funds from this nation for the price that our ancestors paid to help build this country.
You seem to be referring specifically to the issue of reparations. He hasn't made any commitments on that, though he said that he would study the issue. But he knows that he owes so much of his electoral victory to African-American voters. In fact, he told the African-American voters that you've always had my back and I'll have yours. Has he truly addressed, though, all of these issues that you have outlined that are so critical to most Black Americans, the systemic racism that one can see in so many facets of America, not just voting rights, but when it comes to health, to gaps in education and housing, and so many other places?
Well, the reality is, as I said, he could do more, but all of us have to do more. I mean, we have various sectors in our society that have roles to play in all of this as well. I mean, we can't forget that a large portion of our country is really run by corporate America. They have great corporate lobbyists that are in Washington. So I would say that the real pressure should be on the corporate backs and not just on our governmental back. The political leaders pass laws and those corporate lobbyists, help to influence that. So I would say everybody has a role to play in this. And certainly, as the leader of our country, he has an extraordinary role to play, especially since he did make that kind of commitment. But he's not the only one. It's been made by leaders throughout our country from administration to administration.
It's extraordinary to think that almost 60 years ago, in fact, in 1963, your father said this.
I think the tragedy is that we have a Congress with a Senate that has a minority of misguided senators who will use the filibuster to keep the majority of people from even voting. They won't let the majority of senators vote. And certainly they wouldn't want the majority of people to vote because they know they do not represent the majority of the American people. In fact, they represent in their own states.
Referring to the Senate rule that requires a supermajority, a 60 out of 100 votes rather than a simple majority, to enact major legislation, including protecting voting rights. Isn't that the crux of the matter, that no Biden, no Obama, no other president can do anything unless the rules change?
Yeah, I mean, the rules need to be changed. It's a slippery slope. It was created, obviously, during times of segregation, and it has been used in an unjust way. But at the end of the day, the question is, do we need a safeguard like that so that when there are important and critical issues, there's some higher level of accountability, or do we need to just do it by simple majority?
To what extent do you still see major obstacles in the way of race relations in America? Because the country seems to have shifted in many ways in the last year or two when it comes to race. But has there really been a genuine attempt to understand racism in American history, to rectify all the wrongs of hundreds of years of slavery and systemic racism? Racism is a policy of the state. How far do you think white liberals in the US are ready to go to support radical changes, to eradicate racism, not just talking about it, but taking concrete steps, given the political risks that it entails?
Well, I would like to look at it from a global perspective because it's a problem around the world. It's not just in the United States of America. Neo-colonialism, the ramifications of what happened globally around the world to people of color is unfortunate. And so in order for us to address it effectively and eradicate it, my father said something real interesting, that the ultimate answer to this is when people obey the unenforceable. The unenforceable is where law cannot change it. Something has to happen in the hearts of people. And so, yes, we need laws so that people are not treating people unjustly or in a discriminatory manner. But ultimately, we have to continue to educate people. We've got to continue to elevate the consciousness of people. We got to continue to face the horrific past and tell truths about it. And everybody who cares about justice and anybody of goodwill should be a part of that process.
And your father, his ultimate goal, and you have reminded the world about it over the years, is that beloved community, an end to what he often called the three evils: racism, militarism, and poverty. You've tweeted this. You've said, sadly, some use him, in his words, in support of ignoring racism, cultivating false peace, and not even mentioning peace and poverty. Is the beloved community a utopia, or is it achievable?
No, it's not a utopia.
Is it achievable? No. Because you see, in spite of all the progress that have been done in terms of civil rights since the days of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, the country today is so deeply divided. White nationalism, even white supremacy, are well and thriving.
Yeah, but I think there's something to be said about intentionality. And that's why we at the King Center have been very focused on the beloved community, being intentional about it, not letting up about it. Because what happens so often in our country, and no offense to your industry, but the media has a way of framing the next issue and moving to the next issue while we're still dealing with other issues. And so those of us that are in the the activist community, those of us that are humanitarians, those of us that are leaders, we have to create an agenda and be intentional about it on a consistent day-to-day basis. The messaging has to be intentional and forceful, because that's how ultimately change happens. The more something is repeated, the more something is modeled before people over and over again, it eventually becomes a part of their everyday life.
But how concerned are you about what you called the slippery slope? You tweeted a year ago after the failed insurrection on January 6th. This is not abnormal, you said. As my father said, this nation was born in genocide. We have yet to earnestly address America's violent roots, its white supremacy or its racism. If we do not, violence in many forms will persist no matter who is in office. American democracy is backsliding. Many have been arguing. Civil war is no longer a taboo question. Just how concerned are you? What would your father have said or done if he were alive today?
Well, I think that's why it's important that people pay close attention to his I won't say it's his last book, but the book that he published in 1967, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Because he was begging the question, our way forward is one or the other. We will either focus on building this community that for him was the beloved community, or we're going to end up in a reign of chaos. And he gave us ways to do that, shifting priorities, becoming a more people-centered versus a thing-centered society. He talked about changing our loyalties to just being, sectional, to becoming more ecumenical, and ultimately having overriding loyalty to humanity, developing our moral and ethical selves so that technology and science doesn't supersede, our moral and ethical development, and we can keep things in balance and not destroy ourselves in the misuse of so many different instruments. Again, for me, intentionality is very important. I don't think enough of us understand why you have to stick to something. My father was very consistent in his messages. If you listen to many of them, he extracts things from a previous message and puts it in a new message. He may add a little bit to it, but he's repeating himself in different ways. And that was the power of his leadership and why so many people embraced him and followed him, because he was speaking some things consistently and they were following through on those things. And we need that kind of galvanization again.
Let me ask you this finally. 60 years ago, your father was an optimist. And I suppose his optimism was justified because a lot of progress has been made since then on voting rights, on civil rights. How optimistic, though, can a millennial person of color today in America be, particularly in some states, given the erosion in the trust that's going on in government, in key institutions, the vitriol, the sharp divisions among Americans?
Well, I would refute that my father was an optimist. He was actually a realist. He was able to assess and analyze a lot of situations and be very truthful about them, but at the same time maintaining a sense of hope, because he realized that there was a contingency of people who are people of goodwill, who will continue from generation to generation, stand up and let their voices be heard. And we're look, this generation may be a little cynical, but it's also a generation that is determined to hold people accountable. And that's what's critical. We have let too many years pass without accountability. If I can say anything about the millennial generation, they are the accountability in generation. You have to deliver on this. If you're not committed to this, we're not going to commit to you. And that accountability over time, I believe, if it's organized and mobilized under a powerful strategy, is going to make the big difference. And what is perceived as pessimism will turn into hopefulness, and it will end up with some kind of transformation.
Bernice King, a real pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Now, as President Biden enters his second year in office, racial justice and voting rights are not the only parts of his agenda that are being hampered, in large part by Republicans and some Democrats. The 46th president is also struggling to see his Build Back Better infrastructure plan, a major climate change and social policy goal, pass the Senate, where it has been held back by a couple of Democratic senators. And with the COVID-19 death toll inching towards 900,000, the Biden administration faces criticism for its handling of the pandemic and its impact on the economy, with inflation reaching 7%, its highest level in 40 years. And so, 1 year in, Biden's approval rating has fallen to a new low, 33%, according to a recent survey. Another major poll out this week has his approval rating at 44%. It is the second lowest score after Trump's for any American president after 1 year in office. So are President Biden and the Democrats in trouble and possibly heading for defeat at the midterm elections later this year? Joining me now is top Democratic strategist Jess O'Connell. She is the former CEO of the Democratic National Committee. Jess O'Connell, as you know, many Americans today feel frustrated, if not completely disappointed with President Biden after his first year in office. I mean, many of the issues like the pandemic, the economy, inflation are perhaps out of his control, but his handling of these issues is what many Americans seem to have a problem with. Could he have done more to focus on these issues, to tackle these specific issues during his first year in office?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think that President Biden has been extraordinarily focused from day one, his entire administration, on doing a couple of different things. First of all, they came into office very focused on COVID and trying to save lives, and they did just that. Right now, in our country, in America, we've got 74% of adults fully vaccinated, millions of children that are receiving vaccines. We've got 375 million tests that are available for Americans in homes throughout the country every month now, and 95% of the schools are open, and we're working through that with parents and teachers. He's been very focused on this pandemic. If there's frustration out there, which I understand there is, and the president understands that as well, it's because we're not all rowing together still, and we still need folks to get out there and get vaccinated, continue wearing masks where they need to, and work together to ensure that people stay healthy. With respect
But
to
it
the
isn't
economy,
just the vaccine, though. When we're talking about the pandemic, he vowed to fix the persistent shortage of COVID testing. It's still a major issue. There's a major deficit, a shortfall. Experts have been warning for a long time of these, the shortage in these tests. Surely he could have done more to anticipate that there would be a new variant, that there would be a new wave of the pandemic, that he could have gotten ahead of this issue.
I think President Biden, like leaders all around the world, like scientists all around the world, are doing their best to keep up with this pandemic that continues to change, continues to evolve. And I think they're doing a really good job tackling each of these challenges as it goes. As I said,
But do you acknowledge, though?
375 million
But Jess,
tests for families just each month alone. And in addition to the United States sharing out tests to other countries that are in need, I think there's a lot of work being done here and on the supply chain to ensure that we fix this challenge.
But do you accept that he hasn't really fixed the challenge? He hasn't met the challenge. I mean, he himself said it's clearly not enough. He said if we'd known, we would have done more. There's been, a huge number of COVID-related deaths under his watch. When President Trump left office, and you could argue it's out of anyone's control, there were 415,000 deaths, roughly. That was a year ago. Now it's upward of 850,000.
Again, I think as these variants emerge, scientists and the administration here in the United States and others have to figure out how to tackle them together. This is a global pandemic with global ramifications. There's no question about that. I think they've taken each challenge as it comes. I think we're on the right track with respect to beating back Omicron. There's still work to be done here, and we need people to get boosted. We need them to get their shots. And here in the United States, we're fortunate enough, thanks to the leadership of the administration, to be able to go and do just that: get vaccinated, get boosted, wear masks as needed. Masks are being handed out at schools and in other places, libraries throughout the country, and tests are continuing to be procured, produced, and handed out throughout the country as well. And we're going to continue to do that.
There are almost 2,000 deaths every single day. Did President Biden overpromise when he made a pledge to, quote, shut down the virus? Was that a big mistake, to overpromise on something that he knew would be difficult to deliver on?
Look, I think Americans want to understand what the plan is, and by and large, most Americans want to get on board. And I think we need a president who gets out there, who communicates with people about what's happening, who tells the truth, who follows the science. And the science is continuing to evolve the more we learn. The researchers are continuing to do their research and evolve, and we're going to follow the science, and we're going to make sure that Americans have what they need to survive and hopefully to not even catch this virus in the first place. But there's more work to be done. There's no question about it.
And part of most of the work seems to be needed for the majority of Americans is on the economy. It's not just Biden's handling of the pandemic. A majority of Americans say he isn't focusing enough on the economy, on inflation, which is at an almost all-time high. His approval rating is almost as low as Trump's at the same point in their presidency.
I think President Biden is focused like a laser on the economy right now. I think this is taking up a lot of time and energy to ensure that we do what we can to tackle inflation. On the economy, he is overseeing an economy that's grown jobs by 6.4 million jobs. It's historic levels of job growth in the United States. With respect to inflation, he's focused on lowering costs for Americans through his Build Back Better plan. Of course, that's being blocked by Republicans, but Build Back Better would lower costs on healthcare, lower costs on housing, prescription drugs, things that would impact regular Americans every single day in their lives. He's focused on dealing with the supply chain challenges, which we know is a global challenge.
Right, but his agenda is also being blocked by some Democrats. Clearly, he hasn't been able to unite all Americans around his agenda. You said during Trump's presidency,
parts of the agenda. Let me just say, President Biden has done something that has been nearly impossible to do. He's passed two historic pieces of legislation in his first year. First, the American Recovery Act, which lowered child poverty by record rates at a time when we needed it most. And second, the infrastructure bill, which Republicans would have been thrilled to carry under their mantle, but they couldn't get their act together under President Trump. The infrastructure bill is badly needed. It's needed throughout this country to help create jobs and to deal with infrastructure issues all over this country. He got that done. So it's not entirely fair to say that his agenda isn't being accomplished, is not being pushed through. There are people that are still negotiating and debating over pieces of it. Do we wish that were different? Of course. But I think it's really important to acknowledge where he's made gains in a climate that is extraordinarily hostile to that right now.
And you said this during Trump's presidency, that the only, quote, way out of this mess is to ensure Donald Trump is not president. Yet, although Trump isn't president and hasn't been president for a year, according to a major new survey, 58% of Americans believe the nation's democracy is in danger of collapse. And that includes 62% of Republicans, 56% of Democrats. It is the problem that Biden doesn't represent that fundamental change that most Americans are looking for. Americans who believe that so much is broken, that he himself told donors, as you know, that, quote, nothing will fundamentally change if he's elected president.
Well, let me start with where you started, which is one thing I think we can give Donald Trump credit for is hastening the challenges that we're seeing in our democracy, exacerbating structural challenges, exacerbating racial tensions in this country, exacerbating problems around mis and disinformation, not just around COVID and the pandemic, but around just about everything. And the tone and tenor that he brought to not just 4 years of his presidency, but a year or two prior to that campaigning has emboldened other Republicans and other leaders around the country. And so democracy, we are fighting to save democracy here in this country in this moment. But I can tell you it's not in peril because of President Biden.
All right. Jess O'Connell, really good to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
A year in, the Biden presidency is looking shaky, with the president's approval ratings in steady decline. Only Trump had lower ratings at the same stage in his presidency. For now, Americans tend to focus on shortcomings rather than achievements. Biden's coronavirus relief package and his bipartisan infrastructure bill were quickly overshadowed by the emergence of the Omicron variant and the damage it inflicted on the economy, disrupting supply chains and production and causing an inflation spike not seen in 40 years. If inflationary trends cannot easily be reversed, as economists predict, Democrats will find themselves in a bind, just months before the midterm elections, when they could very well lose their tenuous majority in Congress. And so, in short, while the administration struggles to pass new voting rights legislation to offset Republican moves at the state level to, in effect, roll back voting rights for African Americans and other predominantly Democratic voters, the vast majority of Americans seem, for now, more focused on their finances as saving rates plummet. That their democracy is at risk, as Biden and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, warn, does not seem to change their focus. It is the economy stupid, a mantra which was coined 40 years ago, holds true today, and Biden knows that. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the entire team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.